Nick Harper was certain that nothing could break through the fortress of control he had spent years building, until he saw a man yelling at three terrified little girls. Nick Harper didn't believe in fate, emotion, or second chances. As the CEO of one of the largest logistics empires in the country, he had built his life with cold precision and expected the world to operate under the same rules. He had grown up learning that weakness wasn't forgiven, that vulnerability had a cost, and that feelings slowed down success. So he locked them away, every tender instinct, every memory that threatened to stir regret, every name that used to mean something. His life ran like clockwork, morning briefings, private jets, silent black coffee, meetings stacked back to back. He had a calendar filled 6 months in advance and a staff who filtered the world for him. Efficiency was his only compass. That morning was supposed to be the same. Just a routine visit to a private clinic for a standard executive health check. A quick scan, a signature, and back to the office. But as he stepped out of his sleek black car, flanked by security and assistants, he heard something that didn't belong in his carefully controlled world, the sharp, angry voice of a man yelling. Nick paused. It came from near the entrance, harsh words echoing off the stone wall. As he moved toward the source, he saw him, a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, aggressive posture, dark hair cut roughly. And in front of him were 3 small girls. Blonde. Thin. Probably around 6 years old. They stood huddled together, too scared to speak, wide brown eyes full of panic and silence. Their hands were clenched at their sides, their small bodies stiff as boards. Nick watched as the man barked at them again, calling them ungrateful, stupid, asking why they couldn't just do what he said. None of them responded. They just stared at the ground, faces pale, shrinking under the weight of his voice. Something unfamiliar twisted in Nick's chest, a pressure he hadn't felt in years. He didn't understand it at first. He only knew he couldn't walk past it. He approached slowly but directly, and when the man noticed him, his voice dropped but his aggression didn't. "Nothing to see here," the man muttered. "Family stuff." Nick didn't stop. "That's not how you talk to children," he said quietly, but with enough weight to still the air between them. The man bristled. "Who the hell are you?" Nick didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the girls. One was trembling. Another had tears in her eyes but hadn't let them fall. The third just stared up at him with something unreadable, something like hope, or maybe just desperation. And then the man made a mistake. He grabbed one of the girls by the arm and pulled her sharply toward him. Nick's voice was calm, but his expression was like stone. "Let her go. Now." Security had already moved closer. Nick raised a hand to stop them. He wanted to handle this himself. The man let go with a snarl and stepped back. Nick crouched down to the girl's level. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said, not even knowing if that was true. They didn't speak, but one of them, tiny and shaking, reached out and grabbed his sleeve. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't leave them. He asked their names. They spoke softly, "Emma. Claire. Sophie." He asked where their mother was. Claire answered this time, "She's in the hospital. She got sick last night. We waited outside because Mommy said if something bad happens, someone will come." Someone. Nick swallowed hard. Then the man behind him scoffed. "Their mother's in intensive care. I'm her husband. And she never could raise them right." Nick stood, slowly, turned to face him. "Your behavior suggests you shouldn't be near them. I'll be speaking to hospital security and staff about this." The man protested, cursed, threatened, but within minutes, he was surrounded by hospital personnel and escorted away. The girls stayed close to Nick, their trust hesitant but growing with each second. And as they looked up at him, wide-eyed and waiting, he realized he had no plan, no script. But he couldn't walk away. Something inside him refused. And then, as the nurse walked over with an update, she said the name he hadn't heard in 7 years, their mother, Sarah Wells, is still in critical condition. The world tilted under his feet. Sarah. The one woman he had walked away from because he thought she deserved better than a man chained to ambition. The woman he had never stopped thinking about. The mother of these girls. And suddenly, everything Nick thought he knew about his life, his rules, and his past began to unravel. Nick followed the nurse into the hospital, the 3 girls staying close behind him like shadows, their small hands clinging to the hem of his coat. He wasn't used to people depending on him for anything but results or decisions. He had never been someone's safe place. And yet, as they walked through sterile white halls under the glare of fluorescent lights, he became acutely aware that they trusted him, these 3 girls who didn't even know his name. He didn't deserve their trust. He hadn't earned it. But they gave it anyway, maybe because they had no other choice. They were brought to a quiet waiting room outside the ICU, far from the noise and motion of the main floor. The nurse explained that Sarah had been rushed in during the night, internal bleeding, an emergency surgery, then a medically induced coma. Her vitals were stable now, but there was no timeline for her waking. Nick listened, nodding slowly, though the words didn't quite register the way they should have. All he could think about was her name, the last time he'd seen her, the way she had looked at him that night when he left and didn't look back. The girls climbed onto the couch and huddled together. They didn't cry. They were quiet in a way that only came from children who had learned how to manage themselves too early. Nick sat in the chair across from them and studied their faces, their mannerisms. It was eerie, almost painful, how much they resembled Sarah. The hair was different, but the eyes, those deep, expressive brown eyes, were unmistakably hers. And in some strange, undeniable way, he saw something of himself too. It wasn't something he could prove yet, but it was there. In the way Claire tilted her head when she was thinking. In the way Sophie stayed alert while pretending not to look. In Emma's stubborn silence. It unnerved him. It made him question everything. Eventually, the nurse brought in apple juice and a box of crackers, and the girls whispered thank you without being asked. Nick realized they had been trained to make themselves small, to cause no trouble, to not expect much. That realization twisted something in his chest. When had that started? And how had Sarah let this man, whoever he was, husband or not, become part of their lives? Nick turned to the nurse. Is there any family listed in her file? Anyone besides him? The nurse checked the chart and shook her head. Only the girls. No emergency contacts, no next of kin. Just a note that says, if anything happens, please look after my daughters. She looked up, hesitating slightly. And she added a name. Yours. Nick blinked. She put my name down. She did, the nurse confirmed. You're the only one. He leaned back in the chair, stunned. Sarah hadn't spoken to him in over 7 years. They hadn't exchanged a word since the day he left. And still, in what might have been her last conscious act, she had thought of him. Chosen him. Trusted him. It was too much. He stood and walked down the hallway to clear his head. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. But inside, something was shifting rapidly. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't some passing moment of nostalgia or guilt. This was real. These were her daughters. And she had left them with him, at least for now. When he returned to the waiting room, the girls were asleep, curled together like kittens on the couch. One of them had her hand wrapped around the hem of his coat, still holding on even in her dreams. He sat down beside them, more carefully this time, and exhaled slowly. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. He didn't know what kind of father he could be, if he was one at all. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to disappear. Not this time. The next morning began not with alarms or meetings, but with the quiet stirrings of three little girls in a hotel suite that had never hosted children before. Nick had booked the top-floor suite of a five-star hotel across from the hospital without thinking twice. It was the only place nearby with full-time service, and he couldn't stand the idea of the girls waiting alone in a hospital lounge. He arranged for fresh clothes, child-friendly meals, and even toys, though he had no idea what 6-year-old girls actually liked. When the concierge asked if they were his daughters, he didn't correct her. Not because he was sure, but because denying it felt wrong. He stood by the window that morning, dressed in a shirt he hadn't ironed himself in years, sipping coffee that tasted like little. He watched the sunrise stretch across the city skyline, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. In the other room, he could hear quiet voices, Sophie asking where their mom was, Emma reading out loud from a cereal box, Claire insisting her sock had disappeared. It was domestic chaos in miniature, and somehow it felt more grounding than any board meeting ever had. After breakfast, he dressed the girls as best he could and brought them back to the hospital. The nurses greeted them with warm familiarity, already recognizing the three tiny sisters with serious eyes and matching braids. Nick held the elevator door as the girls filed in, each carrying something, Emma with a drawing, Claire with a small stuffed bear, and Sophie clutching a folded note she had written for her mother. None of them asked if she was awake yet. They just looked at the closed ICU door like it held their entire world. Inside the waiting room, Nick met with a hospital social worker. The woman had kind eyes but spoke with quiet firmness, asking the kinds of questions that made him sit straighter. Did he have any legal custody? Did he know the children's medical histories? Did he have proof of paternity? Nick didn't lie. He told her the truth. He didn't know yet if he was their biological father, but he was certain Sarah had listed him as an emergency contact, and the children clearly trusted him. He offered to pay for a paternity test that day. She agreed but made it clear that the process might take time. Later that afternoon, when the girls had fallen asleep curled up on chairs in the sunlit corner of the waiting room, Nick walked down to the lab for the test. He held the swabs in his hands like they were heavier than they were, and when the technician took the samples, he didn't flinch. He didn't know what result he wanted. In some part of him, he already knew. It was written on their faces. When he returned upstairs, Claire stirred in her sleep and reached for him in a way that felt instinctive. He sat beside her and stayed there, unmoving, as she settled against his side. His arm wrapped around her without thought, and she let out a tiny sigh. Something sharp and unfamiliar burned behind his eyes. He didn't cry. But it felt close. By evening, he called his assistant and cancelled the rest of his week. Then the next. For the first time in his adult life, Nick Harper had cleared his calendar completely, not for an emergency board meeting or an international crisis, but for three little girls who might be his daughters and a woman in a hospital bed who might still need him. That night, after dinner and teeth brushing and goodnight stories, the girls lay side by side in the large hotel bed. Just as he was about to leave the room, Sophie sat up and asked softly, "If Mama stays asleep, will you stay with us?" Nick paused in the doorway. He turned around and walked back to her, kneeling beside the bed. "Yes," he said simply. "No matter what happens, I'll stay." Sophie looked at her sisters, then nodded and lay back down. And in that moment, Nick realized something had already changed. Whether the test came back positive or not, whether Sarah woke tomorrow or weeks from now, he had already made his choice. He wasn't going anywhere. The DNA results arrived 3 days later. Nick had been sitting in the hospital cafeteria, pretending to read emails on his tablet while the girls napped upstairs in the family lounge. The call came quietly, without drama or build-up, just a soft vibration in his pocket and a voice on the other end confirming what he already felt in his bones. 99.9% probability. He was their biological father. Emma, Claire, and Sophie weren't just echoes of someone he once loved. They were his. Flesh and blood. His daughters. The call ended, but he didn't move. He sat there, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him, not sure whether to laugh, cry, or run. He had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, survived financial storms that ruined other men, but nothing had ever felt as heavy, as terrifying, or as right as this. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his chest, but not in a way that suffocated. It grounded him. He stood slowly and made his way back to the ICU floor. When he entered the lounge, the girls looked up from the puzzle they were piecing together on the carpet. They didn't ask for news, not about test results or anything else. But they looked at him with those wide, watchful eyes, as if some part of them already knew. He sat down beside them and placed a hand gently on Claire's back. "I got some important news," he said, keeping his voice soft. "It's about you and me." Sophie tilted her head. "Did the hospital lady tell you if you're our dad?" Nick nodded. "She did. And I am." Emma didn't say anything. She just crawled into his lap, rested her head against his chest, and whispered, "I already thought you were." Nick didn't know how long he sat there, holding all three of them, his heart full and fragile at once. They didn't ask what it meant. They didn't ask if he'd be staying. They just knew. And so did he. Later that evening, he stood outside Sarah's hospital room and watched through the glass as machines beeped steadily beside her. Tubes and wires ran across her pale skin, and her chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm. She looked small in the bed, worn down by everything life had thrown at her. But she was still fighting. He remembered the way she used to laugh with her whole face, how fiercely she loved, how she never backed down. Even now, unconscious, she had managed to protect her children, and lead them back to him. Nick stepped inside the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat down. He wasn't a man of long speeches, but the silence between them ached with things that had gone unsaid for too long. "You were right," he said quietly, staring at her motionless hand. "I was afraid. I thought I could walk away clean. That you'd be better off. That I wasn't meant for any of this. But I was wrong. You were braver than I ever gave you credit for. You did this alone. You raised them. You carried all the weight I should have helped you hold." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep going. "They're perfect. You would be so proud of them. And I don't know what happens next, if you wake up tomorrow or in a month or not at all, but I promise you, I'm here now. And I'm not leaving again." He reached out and carefully slid his hand over hers, his fingers wrapping gently around her limp ones. He didn't expect a miracle. He didn't expect her to open her eyes. But for the first time since the day he walked away from her years ago, he felt like he was doing something right. That night, when he returned to the hotel with the girls, something in the atmosphere had shifted. They were louder now, more playful. They laughed at his terrible attempt to make grilled cheese and insisted on brushing his hair after dinner, claiming he had CEO hair that needed fixing. He let them. He let it all happen. He let himself feel the joy, the mess, the overwhelming noise of family life he had once thought he was too broken to want. And when he tucked them in and kissed each forehead, he whispered the same words to all three, "You're safe. I'm here." And he meant it with everything he had. Morning arrived with streaks of golden light pouring through the hotel windows, casting soft warmth across the room where three little girls stirred beneath rumpled blankets. Nick had been awake for hours, not out of habit but because his thoughts refused to let him rest. He had made life-altering decisions in boardrooms, under time pressure, with millions at stake, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet magnitude of this moment. He was a father now. Officially. Unquestionably. And though the truth had rooted itself in his heart the moment Sophie first reached for his sleeve outside the hospital, the weight of confirmation had settled over him like both a responsibility and a gift. He made breakfast again, toast that came out too dark, scrambled eggs that were too soft, but the girls didn't complain. They just giggled, added their own sugar to the juice, and told him they liked when he cooked like a beginner. Emma brought him a drawing with 4 stick figures, 3 girls, and 1 taller figure in a suit and tie, smiling with messy brown scribbles for hair. "That's you," she said. "But we couldn't draw the hotel, so we drew hearts instead." After breakfast, they returned to the hospital. The nurses greeted them like family now. Sophie handed over her daily drawing for her mom. Today it was a sun and a flower growing out of a heart. Nick stood outside Sarah's room and stared through the glass again, hoping for change but preparing himself for stillness. She hadn't stirred since her surgery. The doctors said she was stable but still in a coma, and the word felt heavier each time he heard it. Yet he came anyway. Every day. He told her about the girls' antics, about what Sophie had whispered in her sleep, about how Emma bossed everyone around with quiet authority, and how Claire had a habit of sneaking extra cookies when no one was watching. Sometimes he just sat in silence, holding her hand. That afternoon, the hospital's child protection caseworker asked to speak with him privately. She had reviewed the DNA confirmation, Sarah's medical file, and his own background. She spoke cautiously, measuring her tone as she brought up temporary guardianship. Technically, he still didn't have legal custody, and the girls were considered at risk due to the absence of a conscious parent and the previously reported abuse by Sarah's husband. Nick listened quietly, his jaw tightening at the mention of that man, the one who had yelled at them, the one who called them a burden. He pushed down the fire in his chest and asked what he needed to do. The paperwork was extensive, the interviews scheduled quickly, and home evaluations required. Nick didn't hesitate. He gave his full cooperation. He handed over documents, submitted to background checks, opened his home. For the first time in his life, someone else's needs eclipsed his own, and he didn't try to fight it. His staff didn't recognize this version of him, one who skipped meetings, who missed quarterly briefings, who told his assistant, "Clear my schedule. I've got something more important now." The girls noticed too. They began to smile more easily, sleep more soundly. They no longer asked what would happen tomorrow, because Nick had already answered it with every action. He brushed their hair in the morning, read to them at night, held their hands when they walked through the hospital halls. He didn't need to declare his love for them, they lived it with him, hour by hour. One night, as they returned to the hotel after another visit, Claire slipped her hand into his as they crossed the lobby. "When Mommy wakes up," she said softly, "will you still stay with us?" Nick knelt beside her, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "I'm not going anywhere. Even when she wakes up. Even when things change." Claire nodded solemnly, then hugged him with both arms around his neck. And in that embrace, Nick felt something settle in his chest, a calmness, a belonging. Not the fleeting high of victory or profit, but the steady, unshakable kind of peace that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. He tucked them in that night, kissed their foreheads, and sat by the window long after they had fallen asleep. He stared out at the city, the same skyline that once represented power, distance, control. Now it looked smaller somehow. Less important. Because the most valuable part of his life was sleeping in the next room, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase anything else. A week passed. The girls had begun calling the hotel home, though Nick had already started preparing something better, a real home, not just a temporary sanctuary with room service. He'd hired an architect to convert the upper floor of his townhouse into a dedicated space for the girls, complete with 3 bedrooms and a sunlit playroom. He had never considered what a child needed in a home before, but now every detail mattered. The carpet had to be soft enough for bare feet. The paint colors had to feel warm, not cold. The windows had to open wide enough for light and laughter to get in. He surprised himself with how much he cared. His assistant, long used to his detached efficiency, barely hid her disbelief when he asked her to order a shelf full of bedtime storybooks instead of spreadsheets and legal reports. Sarah remained unconscious. Each day, Nick sat beside her, reading from the journal he had begun to keep. He wrote down everything he noticed about the girls, the way Emma organized everything into neat little piles, how Claire sang to herself when she thought no one was listening, how Sophie had started calling him Dad when she thought he couldn't hear her. The pages filled quickly, and he hoped that one day, when she opened her eyes, she'd be able to read through them and know her daughters had been safe, protected, loved. One evening, after a long day of hospital visits, forms, and yet another meeting with social services, Nick returned to the hotel room to find all three girls waiting by the window, their faces lit by the golden hour glow. They had drawn him another picture. This one showed a big house with 4 stick figures outside, holding hands. Above the house were the words, "Our family," written in uneven block letters. Without hesitation, he crouched down, opened his arms, and let them wrap around him in a tangle of limbs and laughter. No one had ever made him feel like this before, not colleagues, not awards, not success. Just these girls, who had every reason to be afraid, and yet chose to trust him. That night, something shifted. After bedtime stories and a failed attempt at French braids, Nick returned to the hospital alone. The halls were quieter than usual, the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. He stood at Sarah's door for a moment before walking in, the hum of machines greeting him like background music to a life suspended. He sat beside her, took her hand in his, and began to speak softly. "I never asked to be a father. You know that. And maybe I wouldn't have been ready, even if you'd told me all those years ago. I thought I had to protect my ambition, protect the version of myself I worked so hard to build. But now, everything I thought mattered, it's nothing compared to them. I know you were scared, too. I know you did what you thought was right. But you were never alone, Sarah. You didn't have to be. And now I'm here. I'm not running from this. Not anymore." He paused, and for a moment, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only answer. Until her fingers moved. It was subtle, just the twitch of her pinky against his palm, but it was enough. Nick froze, eyes wide, heart suddenly pounding. He leaned forward, watching her face, praying he hadn't imagined it. Then, slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered open. She blinked several times, confused, dazed, and then her gaze focused on him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't seem surprised to see him. Only relieved. Her lips moved, dry and slow. "You stayed," she whispered. Nick nodded, a rush of emotion catching in his throat. "I stayed." Tears pooled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Are they, okay?" "They're more than okay," he said. "They're amazing. And they're waiting for you." He didn't leave her side that night. He sat there for hours, even after she fell asleep again. He didn't call the doctors right away. He wanted that moment to belong to just them, before the world came rushing back in. And in the quiet glow of the ICU, he felt it deep in his soul, something irrevocable had changed. Not just in Sarah, not just in the girls, but in him. He had found the one thing he never knew he was searching for. A reason to stay. A reason to live for something beyond himself. A family. The news of Sarah waking up spread quickly through the hospital. Doctors came in and out, checking vitals, adjusting medications, whispering in clipped, efficient tones. But for Nick, none of it mattered more than the fact that her eyes had opened, that she had seen him, that she had asked about the girls. He remained by her side throughout the morning, answering her quiet, breathless questions in small pieces so she wouldn't grow overwhelmed. Her voice was still weak, but her memory was sharp. She remembered the night she collapsed, remembered the pain, the confusion, and most importantly, she remembered writing his name on the hospital forms. She had hoped, barely conscious at the time, that someone might call him if the worst happened. She hadn't known if he would come. But he had. Sarah's recovery was going to be slow. The doctors warned that her mobility might take time to return, that she'd need physical therapy and monitored care. Nick didn't flinch. He asked for recommendations, made calls to specialists, arranged for in-home care before she even asked. But she didn't ask for anything. In fact, when he offered to move her into the townhouse once she was released, she hesitated. They sat together one evening in her hospital room, the girls asleep in the lounge down the hall. Nick had brought photos, drawings the girls had made that week, blurry pictures of their first visit to the playground near his building, a note from Sophie that said, "We miss you, Mommy, but Daddy is very good at stories." Sarah looked at the note for a long time before setting it gently in her lap. "They call you Daddy," she said softly, her voice still hoarse. "I didn't tell them to," Nick replied. "It just started one day. And I didn't stop it." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was something else in her eyes. "Do they know who you used to be? The man who left before any of this ever started?" "They know I wasn't there," he answered honestly. "But they don't need that story yet. All they care about is that I'm here now." Sarah nodded slowly. "And are you? Are you really here? Because once I leave this hospital, things get real. They ask questions. They cling. They get scared. They break down for no reason. And they love without conditions." "I know," he said. "And that's what scares me the most. Because I don't want to let them down." "You won't," she whispered, then looked down at her hands. "But you might let yourself down if you run again." He took a breath, then reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I'm not running. Not from them. Not from you. Not from the life I could have had if I'd stayed." She didn't cry. Neither did he. But they sat there a long time, her hand in his, the silence between them no longer heavy with regret, but filled with the weight of possibility. 3 days later, Sarah was released into Nick's care. She wasn't strong enough to walk far, but she didn't need to. His townhouse, once cold and lifeless, had transformed into a living space filled with warmth, laughter, and small chaos. The girls ran through the halls barefoot, leaving trails of toys and ribbons. They helped unpack their mother's things and insisted she use the biggest pillow. Emma led the welcome tour, explaining which shelves were for bedtime books and which drawer had the best pajamas. Claire cried the first night Sarah was home, not from fear, but from relief. Sophie held her mother's hand as she fell asleep and whispered, "We knew you'd come back." Sarah sat on the couch later that evening, legs curled under a blanket, watching her daughters play with Nick on the floor. He was letting them tie ribbons in his hair while trying to help them build a paper castle. He looked up at her and smiled, that quiet, new smile that had begun to replace the one she remembered from years ago. The girls shouted and cheered as the tower finally stood. Sarah reached for her tea and leaned back, letting the moment settle into her. Everything had changed, her body, her strength, her trust, but somehow, what had felt broken for so long was being pieced back together by small hands and unexpected grace. This wasn't the life either of them had planned. But it was the one that was meant to be. Spring arrived slowly, as if unsure it was allowed to return, but when it came, it brought soft sunlight through open windows, the scent of fresh rain on pavement, and a kind of peace that had once seemed impossible. It had been 3 months since Sarah came home, and in that time, everything in Nick's world had reshaped itself around a new center, one built not on power or ambition, but on presence, patience, and love. The townhouse, once pristine and quiet, now hummed with the rhythm of family. The walls echoed with footsteps and giggles, with the sound of bedtime stories and cereal bowls clinking in the morning. The furniture had shifted too, sharp edges were padded, the coffee table replaced by an art easel, and the dining room chairs regularly held dolls and toy dinosaurs alongside real people. Nick had stepped back from day-to-day control of his company. At first, the board pushed back, worried about leadership, about image, about continuity. But he stood firm. He no longer measured success in quarterly gains but in the way Emma smiled when he helped her solve a puzzle, or how Claire climbed into his lap during thunderstorms, or how Sophie leaned on his shoulder in silence and sighed like she'd found her safe place. His business didn't collapse. It adapted. And so did he. Sarah regained strength faster than the doctors predicted. Physical therapy sessions turned from struggle to progress, and soon she was walking without assistance, her movements slower than before but just as deliberate. She reclaimed her role as mother with ease and grace, but not in isolation. She let Nick share the burden and the joy. They operated as a team now, passing routines back and forth without resentment. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They had hard conversations in the quiet hours, shared long looks over the heads of giggling children, and held hands when the day left them both overwhelmed. No one asked for guarantees. They just kept choosing each other. One sunny afternoon, the family gathered at the small garden behind the townhouse. The girls had decorated it with streamers and paper flowers, insisting it was a celebration day. No one could quite explain what the celebration was for. There was no official holiday, no birthday, but everyone agreed it felt like one. Sarah sat on a bench in the shade, her legs tucked under her, watching as the girls ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter rising like music. Nick stood by the grill, wearing an apron someone had jokingly gifted him that read, "CEO of the barbecue." He looked ridiculous and knew it, but when Claire threw her arms around his waist and called him, "the best dad ever," he didn't care about appearances. After lunch, the girls put on a small performance. They had written a play, completely chaotic, full of costume changes and missed lines, but it ended with all three of them shouting, "And that's why we love our family," before taking a dramatic bow. Everyone clapped, and Sophie turned to Sarah with a shy smile. "We made it for you. Because you're our favorite person." Then she turned to Nick. "But he's our hero." Nick knelt to their level, pulling them into a hug so tight it made them squeal. Sarah walked over and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up at her, and for a moment, the world seemed to still around them. Not in the way that demanded silence, but in a way that made space for everything they had endured and everything they had become. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in a fort made of couch cushions and blankets, Nick and Sarah sat on the back steps, watching the sun dip low. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to explain, no need to relive what had already healed. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't think we'd get here." "I didn't either," he said. "But I'm glad we did." He looked out at the yard, at the paper flowers swaying in the breeze, at the soft glow of string lights wrapped around the porch railing. This wasn't the life he had imagined when he was younger, when success meant silence and solitude and clean lines. This life was messy. Loud. Full. Unpredictable. But it was also the most real thing he had ever known. Nick reached for her hand and held it tightly. They had come through fire. They had faced absence, regret, uncertainty, and fear. But in the end, they had built something together, something neither of them had dared to dream before it was almost lost. Not a perfect life. A whole one. This story's ending feels like a quiet triumph, not because everything turns out perfectly, but because the characters earn every step toward healing and connection. Nick's transformation isn't sudden or exaggerated, it's honest. He doesn't become a flawless father or partner overnight, but he shows up, again and again, even when it's hard. That's what makes the ending powerful, it's grounded in real emotion, not fantasy. The final scenes don't wrap life in a neat bow, they reveal a deeper truth. Family isn't built by blood alone, or by grand gestures, but by the small, consistent moments of presence and choice. The paper flowers, the makeshift play, the porch conversations, they are the proof that love grows in the mess, not outside of it. What began with indifference ends with deep belonging, and in that transformation lies the story's heart. It reminds us that no one is too far gone to begin again.